I should have known something was wrong when the cogitator screen started flickering in patterns that looked almost like words. 3 months into my assignment as a data scribe aboard the orbital processing station, Eternal Vigilance, and I had grown accustomed to the machine spirit's occasional temperamental displays. The ancient cogitators that governed our operations had served the Imperium for over 2 millennia, their blessed circuits worn thin by countless years of faithful service. But this was different. The patterns held too much meaning, formed shapes that tugged at the corners of my consciousness like half-remembered prayers. The station hung in the void above Kythera Prime, a forge world whose surface bristled with manufactorums and plasma furnaces that painted the planet's atmosphere in shades of amber and rust. My duty was simple enough: process the endless streams of production data flowing up from the surface, catalog resource allocations, and ensure the proper tithes were calculated for shipment to the sector capital. The work demanded absolute precision but little creativity, which suited the administratum's preferences perfectly. A single miscalculation could result in shortfalls that might cripple an entire campaign against the Emperor's enemies, or worse, invite the attention of an inquisitorial audit. The whispers began on the 93rd day of my assignment, though I didn't recognize them as whispers at first. They manifested as static in the Vox channels, as fluctuations in the data streams that caused numbers to blur and dance before my eyes. I attributed the phenomena to the station's age and the constant electromagnetic interference from Kythera Prime's industrial operations. The tech adepts who maintained our systems were perpetually overtaxed, their mechanical limbs clicking and whirring as they performed the endless rituals necessary to keep our ancient machinery functional. Senior Scribe Malarian, my supervisor, was a thin man whose augmetic left eye clicked softly whenever he blinked. He had served aboard Eternal Vigilance for over 30 years, rising through the ranks of the administratum through a combination of methodical competence and carefully cultivated blindness to irregularities that might complicate his reports. When I mentioned the unusual static patterns during our morning briefing, he dismissed my concerns with a wave of his stylus. "The machine spirits grow restless sometimes," he said, not looking up from his data slate, "especially when the forge world's output increases. The electromagnetic resonance can cause peculiar effects in sensitive equipment. Continue your duties and trust in the Emperor's protection." His augmetic eye focused on me with mechanical precision. "Unless you believe there's something more significant to report." The question carried an undertone of warning. In the administratum, curiosity was acceptable only when it served efficiency. Excessive interest in anomalies could be interpreted as a dangerous deviation from prescribed duties. I assured him that I understood and returned to my station. But the patterns in the cogitator screens seemed to pulse with greater intensity that afternoon. My workspace occupied a corner of Processing Bay Gamma, a cavernous chamber lined with banks of cogitators and data storage units. The air tasted of ozone and sacred oils, while the constant hum of cooling systems provided a mechanical lullaby that most scribes found soothing. Red emergency lighting cast everything in bloody shadows, broken by the pale blue glow of countless display screens. The other scribes worked in focused silence, their fingers dancing across runic keyboards as they translated the will of the Imperium into numerical reality. That evening, during the night shift rotation, I found myself alone with junior scribe Valdris, a young woman whose devotion to duty bordered on the obsessive. She had arrived on the station only weeks after my own assignment began. Fresh from the administratum colleges on Scintilla, her dark hair cropped short in regulation fashion and her brown eyes bright with zealous determination. Unlike the veteran scribes, who had learned to find a sustainable rhythm in their work, Valdris attacked each data stream with religious fervor, cross-referencing every entry against multiple databases and flagging discrepancies that her more experienced colleagues would have overlooked. "Have you noticed anything unusual about the cogitators lately?" I asked her during one of our brief rest periods. We sat in the small alcove that served as a break area, sharing rations and recycled water, while the station's night cycle lighting cast everything in dim blue hues. Valdris looked up from her ration pack, her expression thoughtful, Define unusual. The machine spirits have been more active recently. But that's to be expected given the increased production schedules from the surface. Sector Command has raised the quotas for blessed ammunition and vehicle components, which means longer operational cycles for all planetary facilities. I meant something beyond normal fluctuations, I said carefully. Patterns that seem almost deliberate, as if something were trying to communicate through the systems. Her expression hardened almost imperceptibly, and I realized I had crossed an invisible line. Communication implies intelligence, she said, her voice taking on the measured cadence of recited doctrine. The only intelligence that should concern us flows from the Emperor's divine will, filtered through the proper channels of command authority. Everything else is superstition or worse. I nodded and changed the subject, but I could feel her watching me with new scrutiny for the remainder of our shift. Word of my questions would almost certainly reach Senior Scribe Malorian within the day, and from there potentially climb higher up the station's administrative hierarchy. The administratum maintained its efficiency through careful observation of its own personnel, and I had just marked myself as someone worth watching. The next morning brought new complications. The production reports from Manufacturing Complex Theta 7 contained irregularities that defied easy explanation. According to the data streams, the facility had exceeded its projected output by nearly 15% over the past week, but the resource consumption rates remained within normal parameters. Either the complex had achieved impossible efficiency gains, or something was manipulating the data before it reached our processing station. I spent hours cross-referencing the figures against historical baselines, searching for some rational explanation for the discrepancy. The patterns that had been haunting the cogitator screens seemed to intensify as I worked, forming shapes that almost resembled letters in an alphabet I didn't recognize. The static in my headset grew more pronounced, occasionally resolving into sounds that might have been words if I could only focus hard enough to understand them. Scribe Corran. Senior Scribe Malorian's voice cut through my concentration like a blade. I looked up to find him standing beside my station, his augmetic eye clicking as it adjusted its focus. Your productivity reports indicate a significant decline in processing speed over the past 48 hours. Is there a problem with your equipment? No, sir, I replied, gesturing toward my screen. I've been investigating some anomalous data from Manufacturing Complex Theta 7. The production figures don't align with resource consumption rates, and I wanted to ensure accuracy before filing the reports. Malorian leaned over my shoulder, studying the data with his mechanical precision. His augmetic eye whirred softly as it processed the information, and I caught a faint scent of sacred oils and burned metal that seemed to emanate from his cybernetic components. I see the irregularities you've identified, he said after a long moment. However, our duty is to process and relay information, not to investigate discrepancies beyond our assigned purview. Manufacturing Complex Theta 7 falls under the oversight of Magos Secundus Thaxion. If there are genuine problems with their reporting protocols, they will be identified and corrected through proper channels. But sir, if the data is incorrect, the data is what it is, he interrupted, his augmetic eye focusing on me with uncomfortable intensity. We process, we relay, we move to the next assignment. That is the path of duty, and it has served the Imperium well for 10,000 years. Your concerns have been noted and will be included in my weekly reports to sector administration. Now please return to standard processing protocols. I accepted his rebuke with appropriate humility, but the anomalous data continued to trouble me throughout the day. The whispers in the static grew stronger, more insistent, and I began to suspect that they were connected to the irregularities in the manufacturing reports. Something was happening on the surface of Kythera Prime, something that the proper authorities either hadn't noticed or were choosing to ignore. That night, long after the day shift had departed and most of the night shift had settled into their routine tasks, I decided to conduct my own investigation. Using my administrative access codes, I began pulling historical data from Manufacturing Complex Theta 7, looking for patterns that might explain the recent anomalies. What I found sent cold fingers of dread crawling up my spine. The irregularities weren't new. They stretched back over months, perhaps even years, but they had been so subtle that they had escaped notice amid the overwhelming flood of data that passed through our processing systems. Production efficiency had been gradually increasing while resource consumption remained stable, suggesting either miraculous improvements in manufacturing techniques or systematic falsification of reports. More disturbing still, similar patterns appeared in data from other complexes across the planet's surface, always just below the threshold that would trigger automated alerts. As I delved deeper into the historical records, the whispers in the static became clearer, more distinct. They spoke in low Gothic, but the words were wrong somehow, twisted into shapes that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. They promised knowledge, power, freedom from the endless drudgery of administrative duty. They offered answers to questions I hadn't known I was asking, solutions to problems that had been gnawing at the edges of my consciousness for weeks. The voice was seductive, reasonable, infinitely patient. It explained how the manufacturing complexes had indeed improved their efficiency, but not through better techniques or superior materials. They had made contact with forces that existed beyond the narrow confines of Imperial doctrine, entities that could offer technological insights undreamed of by even the most learned tech priests. The increased production rates were just the beginning, a small taste of the gifts that awaited those wise enough to embrace change. I found myself leaning closer to the Vox unit, straining to catch every word despite the growing pain in my skull. The voice continued its gentle instruction, teaching me to see the patterns hidden within the data streams, showing me how numbers could be more than mere quantities. They were symbols, gateways, invocations that could reshape reality if properly understood and applied. The Emperor's servants had spent 10 millennia learning to process information, but they had never learned to truly comprehend it. I pushed back from the terminal, my chair scraping against the metal decking. The voice had fallen silent, leaving only the ambient hum of the ship's systems and my own ragged breathing. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, where impossible equations still pulsed with that sickly pink luminescence. The numbers seemed to writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them, forming patterns that hurt to perceive but felt essential to understand. Adept Xerion? Sanctioned Psyker, Thrace's voice cut through my stupor. I hadn't heard her approach, lost as I was in contemplation of what I'd just experienced. She stood in the doorway, her augmetic eyes glowing softly in the dim light of the cogitation chamber. You appear distressed. I quickly shut down the terminal, though the afterimage of those equations lingered in my vision. Minor calculation error. I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. The machine spirits are restless today. Thrace stepped closer, and I noticed her psychic hood was active, its neural cables twitching slightly as she probed the atmosphere around me. Her scarred face was impassive, but I caught a flicker of something, concern, suspicion, in her expression. "You've been at this terminal for 14 hours without break," she said. "The Omnissiah values dedication, but flesh requires rest, even when augmented." Her gaze lingered on my hands, which I realized were still shaking. "Perhaps you should return to your sanctum." "Perhaps," I agreed, though I made no move to leave. The voice had promised to return, and some part of me, a part I didn't want to examine too closely, yearned to hear it again. The knowledge it offered was intoxicating, each whispered secret expanding my understanding in ways that my orthodox training never could. Thrace's hood twitched more violently. "Xerion." Her voice carried a note of warning now. "There are currents in the warp around you. Unusual patterns. When did you last submit to psychic screening?" The question sent ice through my augmented nervous system. Sanctioned psychers like Thrace were bound to report any signs of corruption or heretical thought. If she detected the lingering traces of whatever had spoken to me. 3 months ago, I lied smoothly. Standard rotation. Tech Priest Valian conducted the rites personally. The fabrication came easily. Too easily. I realized with a start that the voice had taught me more than mathematical concepts. It had shown me how to shape words, how to construct truths that weren't quite lies, how to hide meaning beneath layers of acceptable discourse. Thrace studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "See that you maintain your spiritual hygiene, Adept. The Emperor's light grows dim in the deepest reaches of space, and we are far from the Astronomican's guidance." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Kellyan? The Magos requests your presence in the primary laboratory at the next shift change. We're approaching the Xerion system." After she left, I sat in the darkness for what felt like hours, though my chronometer indicated only 17 minutes had passed. The ship groaned around me as we transitioned back to real space, the familiar sensation of warp exit making my stomach lurch. Through the bulkhead, I could hear the distant chanting of the navigator and his attendants as they guided us safely back to material reality. The Xerion system. I'd studied the cartographic data. 13 worlds orbiting a dying red giant, most of them lifeless rocks scorched by millennia of stellar radiation. But the fourth world, Xerion Prime, was different. It had been a thriving hive world once, before the Great Crusade, before compliance, before something had gone wrong. The records were fragmentary, classified at levels far above my clearance. All I knew was that Xerion Prime had gone silent 2 centuries ago, its astropathic choir falling suddenly mute. Exploratory missions had found the cities intact but empty. The population simply vanished without trace or struggle. Now the Adeptus Mechanicus was finally mounting a proper expedition to recover whatever technologies might remain. I made my way through the ship's corridors, past servitors conducting their endless maintenance rituals and junior adepts hunched over data slates. The familiar sounds and smells of shipboard life, ozone from electrical systems, the acrid tang of recirculated air, the rhythmic chanting from the engineerium, should have been comforting. Instead, they seemed hollow, meaningless, like the scripted responses of actors who had forgotten their true purpose. The voice had shown me something beyond the rigid orthodoxy of the machine cult, something that made our careful observances seem childish by comparison. Why prostrate ourselves before ancient STCs when we could create new technologies? Why limit ourselves to the approved patterns when innovation waited just beyond our fingertips? The questions felt dangerous even to contemplate, but I couldn't shake them. Magos Zereth's laboratory occupied the entire forward section of Deck 7, a maze of experimental chambers and cogitation banks that hummed with barely contained power. I found him in the central sanctum, his massive form hunched over a hololith displaying the Xerion system in exquisite detail. His mechadendrites writhed as he manipulated the display, zooming in on specific orbital bodies and analyzing their thermal signatures. "Ah, Kellyan," he said without looking up, his voice a synthesized rasp through his Vox grill. "Your timing is acceptable. I require your expertise with xenoarchaeological data analysis." "Of course, Magos." I approached the hololith, noting the strange geometric formations on Xerion Prime's surface. Structures too regular to be natural, too alien to be human. "What have the auger arrays detected?" "Anomalous readings," Xereth replied, manipulating the display to highlight several locations on the planet's surface. "Energy signatures that don't match any known Imperial or Xenos technology in our databases. And there's something else. The planetary noosphere appears to be active." I felt my blood chill. A noosphere was the theoretical information space surrounding a technologically advanced civilization, the invisible network of data streams and communication protocols that allowed machine spirits to commune. If Xerion Prime's noosphere was still active after 2 centuries of abandonment, it suggested something was maintaining it, something that wasn't human. "The expedition will make planetfall in 36 hours, Xereth continued. "I want you to prepare the deep scan cogitators for xenotech analysis." And Kellyan, his optical arrays focused on me with uncomfortable intensity. "This mission is classified at the highest levels. The Inquisition has taken an interest in our findings. Ensure that all data is properly sanctified before transmission." The Inquisition, the Emperor's most dedicated servants, fanatical in their pursuit of heresy and corruption. If they were involved, it meant Xerion Prime held secrets that could threaten the very foundations of the Imperium. I nodded my understanding, though inwardly I felt that familiar whisper of curiosity, the same hunger for forbidden knowledge that had led me to listen to the Chaos voice in the first place. As I worked through the night, calibrating cogitation matrices and preparing data-sifting algorithms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by the Magos or his servo skulls, but by something else, something that existed in the spaces between thoughts, in the gaps of transmitted data. Several times I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't exist, geometric patterns that resolved into familiar pink luminescence when I turned to look directly at them. The voice came to me again as I worked, no longer needing the Vox unit to manifest. It spoke directly into my consciousness, its words bypassing my ears entirely and resonating in the quantum foam of my enhanced neural pathways. "You begin to understand," it said, approval warming its tone. "The barriers between flesh and data, between thought and reality, are far more permeable than your kind believes. What awaits on Xerion Prime will teach you truths that your omnisia could never comprehend." I tried to focus on my work, but the voice continued its gentle instruction. It showed me how to modify the cogitation matrices in ways that would reveal hidden patterns in the data, how to construct algorithms that could perceive beyond the normal spectrum of information. Each modification was subtle, undetectable to standard scans, but together they would transform our expedition's findings in ways I couldn't yet fully grasp. "The great work requires many hands," the voice whispered, as I implemented its suggestions with trembling fingers. "Your people seek the omnissiah, the supposed perfection of flesh and machine. But what they truly seek is change itself, the eternal transformation that drives all existence toward its ultimate purpose. Help us, and we will help you transcend the crude limitations of your current understanding." By morning, I had transformed our entire analytical framework. The changes were so subtle, so elegantly integrated, that they appeared to be natural improvements to existing systems. When Magos Zerath reviewed my work, he actually commended my initiative in optimizing the detection algorithms. He couldn't see what I had truly done, how I had opened doorways in our data streams, created pathways through which something vast and alien could observe our findings. As we entered orbit around Xerion Prime, I stood at the observation deck's great window and gazed down at the world below. Its surface was a patchwork of abandoned cities and strange geometric formations that hurt to look at directly. Somewhere down there, in the ruins of human civilization, waited secrets that would either damn us all or elevate us to heights of understanding we had never imagined possible. The voice whispered one final instruction as I prepared to join the landing party. "Remember, young seeker, chaos is not destruction, but pure potential. What your people call corruption, we call evolution. What awaits below will show you the difference between the two." I touched the blessed cogtooth hanging at my throat, murmuring the ritual words of protection. But even as I performed the familiar observances, I knew that something fundamental had already changed within me. The whispers had shown me a glimpse of infinite possibility, and I could no more ignore that revelation than I could stop my augmented hearts from beating. The first time you hear the chaos whispers, you think you're still yourself. You believe you can listen and learn without being changed. It's only later, as you implement their suggestions and feel the intoxicating rush of forbidden understanding, that you realize the truth. The moment you choose to hear them, they've already begun remaking you in their image. The changes came slowly at first, like a tide creeping up a distant shore. I convinced myself they were merely improvements, enhanced pattern recognition, accelerated processing speeds, a newfound ability to perceive the elegant mathematics underlying seemingly random events. My fellow tech adepts noticed my increased efficiency, and Magos Vex praised my innovative approaches to machine spirit communion. None of them suspected that my innovations came not from orthodox training, but from whispered secrets that made the binary cant seem as primitive as cave paintings. It was during a routine maintenance ritual on the forge world of Metallica that I first acted on the Whisper's guidance without conscious deliberation. We were attempting to reactivate an ancient cogitator array, its machine spirits dormant for millennia. The prescribed rituals had failed repeatedly, and Magos Vex was growing impatient with our lack of progress. As my mechadendrites interfaced with the primary data port, the whispers surged through my consciousness with unprecedented clarity. "The spirits sleep because they dream of order," they murmured. "Wake them with contradiction. Show them the beauty of impossible logic." Without thinking, I began tracing non-Euclidean geometries across the cogitator's surface with my servo-skull's plasma cutter. The symbols burned into the adamantium were wrong in ways that hurt to perceive angles that folded back on themselves, equations that simultaneously proved and disproved their own validity. My fellow tech adepts recoiled in horror, but the machine spirits responded immediately. The cogitator array blazed to life with a light that seemed to come from somewhere other than its illumination strips. "Fascinating," Magos Vex said, his voice carefully neutral. "Where did you learn such unconventional activation protocols?" I realized then that I had no acceptable answer. The truth would see me branded as heretic and subjected to immediate termination. So I lied, invoking obscure pre-Age of Strife texts and theoretical frameworks that might plausibly explain my methods. Vex accepted my explanation, but I caught him studying me with increased attention in the days that followed. The whispers celebrated my success with a euphoria that flooded my neural networks. "You see how easy it is when you embrace the possible?" Asterisk, they crooned. "How much more we could accomplish if you stopped clinging to their limiting dogma." But their praise came with a price. Each time I listened, they grew stronger, more persistent. They began commenting on everything: my daily rituals, my interactions with colleagues, even my private moments of contemplation. Their voice became as familiar as my own internal monologue, until I sometimes couldn't tell where their suggestions ended and my thoughts began. The transformation accelerated when we returned to our forge world. I found myself modifying my augmentations without conscious planning, following half-remembered instructions whispered during my recharge cycles. New neural pathways opened in my cerebral implants, allowing me to process information in ways the Omnissiah's doctrine deemed impossible. My optical arrays developed the ability to perceive probability cascades as visible emanations, showing me the potential outcomes of actions before they occurred. Most disturbing of all, I began to see the flaws in everything around me, the inefficiencies in sacred rituals, the limitations of blessed technologies, the stagnation that masqueraded as holy tradition. The forge world that had once seemed like a temple to knowledge now felt like a prison of willful ignorance. It was Adept Calix who first noticed the changes. We had served together for 3 decades, and his keen intellect missed little. During a routine blessing of plasma coils, he observed my hands moving in patterns that deviated subtly from orthodox forms. "Your ritual postures have evolved," he noted, his vox grill crackling with what might have been concern. "The modifications are efficient, but their theological basis is unclear." The whispers immediately offered solutions, ways to deflect his attention, to sow doubt in his observations, even more direct methods of ensuring his silence. I rejected their suggestions with what remained of my orthodox conditioning, but the fact that I had considered them at all filled me with dread. "Innovation within tradition," I replied carefully. "The machine spirits respond favorably to minor variations that demonstrate understanding rather than rote memorization." Calix's optical lenses whirred as they focused on me. "Perhaps, but innovation without theological foundation risks the charge of heretical deviation. I speak as a friend who values your contributions to our sacred work." His warning was clear, and I knew he was right to give it. But the whispers had already shown me how hollow our sacred traditions were, how they served not enlightenment but control. Every ritual was a chain, every prayer a limitation imposed by minds too fearful to embrace the infinite potential that chaos offered. That night, during my recharge cycle, the whispers spoke more directly than ever before. Instead of their usual subtle suggestions, They presented me with vivid visions, glimpses of what I could become if I fully embraced their teachings. I saw myself wielding technologies that transcended the crude limitations of Imperial science, creating wonders that would make even the dark age of technology seem primitive by comparison. You still fear their judgment, the whispers observed. But what is their approval worth? They worship a corpse god and call stagnation holy. We offer transcendence, evolution, the chance to become something greater than human, greater than machine. Why do you hesitate? Because I wanted to answer, because I remember what I was before you came. Because some part of me still believes in the Omnissiah's truth, in the righteousness of our cause. Because I fear what you're turning me into. But I said nothing, and in that silence, they found their answer. The next morning brought new complications. Magos Vex summoned me to his private sanctum, a chamber lined with cogitators and blessed with incense that made my modified senses ache. He stood before a hololithic display showing the cogitator array I had awakened, its impossible symbols still burning with unnatural light. The activation protocols you employed have produced interesting results, he began without preamble. The machine spirits are processing data at rates that exceed theoretical maximums. They're generating solutions to problems we haven't even posed yet. The Omnissiah's blessing manifests in mysterious ways, I replied, falling back on orthodox platitudes, while the whispers laughed at my hypocrisy. Indeed. But mysteries require investigation. His mechadendrites writhed with agitation. I've submitted your methods to the Forge World's Theological Review Board. They wish to examine your techniques in detail, to determine if they represent divine inspiration or... He paused meaningfully. Something else. The whispers immediately began calculating escape routes, cataloging weapons within reach, identifying the optimal points to strike if violence became necessary. I forced myself to remain still, to project calm while my thoughts raced through possibilities. I welcome their scrutiny, I said. My faith in the Omnissiah is absolute. But even as I spoke the words, I knew they were lies. My faith had been corrupted, transformed into something unrecognizable. The Omnissiah I once worshipped seemed distant and cold compared to the vital, dynamic force that spoke through the whispers. Where once I had found certainty in doctrine, I now craved the intoxicating uncertainty of unlimited possibility. Vex dismissed me with instructions to prepare for the theological review, but I knew I would never submit to their examination. They would find the changes in my neural pathways, discover the heretical modifications I had made to my augmentations. Even if they couldn't prove conscious heresy, they would declare me compromised and order my termination. The whispers agreed. They cannot be allowed to interfere with your evolution, they murmured, as I returned to my quarters. You've come too far to let their fear destroy what we've built together. There are others like you, scattered across the galaxy, minds touched by truth, souls elevated beyond their crude limitations. It's time you met them. That night, I accessed the Vox network with modifications the whispers guided me through, reaching out through encrypted channels that existed in the spaces between official Imperial frequencies. The responses came from across the sector, tech adepts and magos, even some shipbound explorators who had heard the same whispers that haunted my thoughts. They called themselves the Transcendent Truth, and they had been waiting for me. Brother, came a Vox transmission from someone identifying himself as Magus Hereticus Vane. We sensed your awakening through the warp echoes of your work. The impossible geometries you carved sang across space itself. Will you join us in the pursuit of true knowledge? The whispers urged me toward acceptance, but some stubborn core of my original self resisted. To answer would be to cross a line from which there could be no return. I would become truly heretic, an enemy of everything I had once sworn to defend. But what have they ever offered you except limitations? The whispers asked. Asterisk. What has their truth given you but chains? We offer freedom, the freedom to become what you were always meant to be. As if to emphasize their point, an alert chimed through my neural network. The Theological Review Board was convening early. They wanted to see me within the hour. The choice was no choice at all. I activated the Vox transmitter and spoke the words that would damn me forever in the eyes of the Imperium. "I am ready to embrace the truth," I said. The whispers sang with joy, and I felt the last chains of my former faith shatter. Whatever I had been before, whatever loyalty I had sworn to the false god on Terra, it was over now. I was something new, something unprecedented, and I was no longer alone. The response came within minutes, a location deep in the Underhive, coordinates that led to abandoned manufactorums where the Emperor's light had never properly reached. As I made my way through the labyrinthine corridors of the station, past sleeping crew members and automated servitors, the whispers provided a constant stream of guidance. Asterisk. Left here. Down 3 levels. Avoid the patrol route at Junction 7 Alpha. I moved like a ghost through my own command, invisible to those I had once called brothers. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent decades hunting heretics who moved exactly as I moved now, guided by voices that shouldn't exist, pursuing truths that couldn't be spoken. The transit shuttle to the planet's surface required careful timing. I waited in the docking bay's shadows until the automated cycle began, then slipped aboard a supply hauler bound for Tertius Prime's capital hive. The pilot, a servitor with most of his humanity carved away, registered my presence with empty eyes, but asked no questions. The inquisitorial seal still carried weight, even as I prepared to betray everything it represented. During the descent through Tertius Prime's polluted atmosphere, I felt the whispers growing stronger. The planet itself seemed to pulse with an energy I had never noticed before, or perhaps had trained myself not to notice. Below us, the vast urban sprawl stretched to the horizon, a cancer of humanity that had consumed an entire world in service to the throne. But now I could sense something else beneath the familiar patterns of Imperial architecture. Older geometries, forgotten angles, spaces that existed between what the eye could see. Soon, the voices promised. Soon, you will understand everything. The coordinates led me through increasingly degraded sectors of the Hive City. Here, in the spaces between official Imperial presence, I began to see signs of what I was truly walking into. Graffiti in languages that hurt to look at directly. Shadows that moved independently of their sources. Citizens who averted their eyes not from fear of authority, but from recognition of something else entirely. I descended through maintenance shafts and forgotten transit tunnels, following paths that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The whispers guided me past patrol routes, through checkpoints that shouldn't have existed, around dangers I couldn't name but instinctively understood. With each step, deeper into the Underhive, I felt my old identity falling away like shed skin. The abandoned manufactorum complex sat in a crater of urban decay, its vast halls empty of everything except the machinery too large or worthless to salvage. But as I approached the specified coordinates, I realized the emptiness was an illusion. There were people here, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. They emerged from shadows and alcoves with a fluid grace that spoke of long practice, moving in patterns that seemed random but felt perfectly choreographed. At their center stood a figure I recognized from surveillance footage, though seeing him in person was entirely different. Magos Explorator Quintinus had once been a respected member of the Adeptus Mechanicus, his augmentations following approved patterns, his research sanctioned by Mars. Now he was something else entirely. His mechanical limbs moved with impossible fluidity, their surfaces covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. Most disturbing of all were his eyes, still human, still aware, but filled with a knowledge that no loyal servant of the Omnissiah should possess. "Inquisitor Valix," he said, his voice a harmonic blend of organic and synthetic tones. "We have been expecting you." Around him, the assembled figures watched with quiet intensity. I recognized some faces from my investigations: suspected cultists, heretical tech adepts, citizens who had simply vanished from official records. But there were others whose presence defied explanation. Individuals who wore the uniforms of loyal Imperial servants, who bore the augmentations of Orthodox Mechanicus training, who should have been reporting this gathering to the authorities rather than participating in it. "I received your transmission," I said, my voice steady despite the momentous nature of what I was doing. "You spoke of truth, of knowledge that the Imperium suppresses." Quintinus tilted his head in a gesture that managed to seem both mechanical and deeply organic. "Truth is a complex concept, Inquisitor. What we offer is not mere information, but understanding. The ability to perceive reality as it truly is, rather than through the distorting lens of Imperial doctrine." He gestured to the assembled crowd. "Each person here came to us as you have come, following whispers that their training told them to reject, pursuing questions that their faith forbade them to ask. They learned that the Emperor's light, for all its brilliance, casts very deep shadows." One of the figures stepped forward, a woman wearing the robes of a Ministorum priest, though her version of the Imperial creed had clearly evolved beyond orthodox parameters. "The God Emperor exists," she said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "But he is not what the ecclesiarchy teaches. He is not what even he believed himself to be." "Listen," the whispers urged. Asterisk. "Finally, listen to what you have always known but feared to understand. 10,000 years ago," the priest continued, "a man of extraordinary vision and power sought to guide humanity away from superstition and toward rational enlightenment. But in his very success, he created the greatest superstition of all. He became the focus for the psychic energy of countless billions of human souls, their faith and fear and desperate hope. That energy had to go somewhere." Quintinus picked up the thread, his mechanical voice weaving seamlessly with her organic tones. "The Emperor became a god not through choice, but through the inexorable pressure of human belief. And gods, true gods, exist in dimensions that transcend the merely physical. They touch realms that Imperial doctrine calls the warp, but which are far more complex and nuanced than the simple binary of order and chaos that the Imperium recognizes." I felt something shifting in my understanding, like tectonic plates realigning deep beneath my consciousness. "You're saying that the Emperor, he's real, is powerful, is, in the truest sense, divine," another voice said. This speaker wore the uniform of an Imperial Guard colonel, his chest decorated with medals for campaigns I had read about in official reports. "But divinity operates according to laws that transcend human understanding. The Emperor's consciousness exists simultaneously across multiple dimensions of reality, experiencing existence from perspectives that no single mortal mind could comprehend." The whispers in my head grew stronger, more coherent, as if proximity to these people somehow amplified their clarity. I began to understand that what I had been hearing wasn't external at all. It was my own mind, finally learning to process information that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of conditioning and willful ignorance. "The voice you hear," Quintinus said, apparently reading my thoughts, "is your own psychic potential awakening to broader spectrums of reality. Every human possesses this capacity, but the Imperium's indoctrination programs are specifically designed to suppress it. They create artificial neural pathways that redirect psychic awareness into narrow channels of faith and obedience." The Ministorum priest nodded. "The ecclesiarchy's rituals, the mechanical prayers, the constant repetition of approved doctrines, these aren't just spiritual exercises, they're neurological programming, designed to prevent exactly the kind of awakening you're experiencing now." I thought of my years of training, the endless hours of meditation and prayer, the careful cultivation of orthodox thought patterns. Had it all been a deliberate attempt to blind me to reality? But the dangers of the warp, the entities that exist there, are real, Quintinus confirmed. But they are not inherently hostile. They are alien, operating according to logics that seem chaotic or malevolent only from our limited perspective. The Emperor himself has learned to work with these forces, to channel them toward purposes that transcend the simple survival of the human species. The colonel stepped closer, his scarred face intense with conviction. "I've served in campaigns across a dozen sectors, fought enemies that defied every principle of rational warfare. I've seen things that should have driven me insane, if Imperial doctrine were accurate. But once you learn to perceive the deeper patterns, once you understand that reality is far more flexible than the Mechanicus teaches, those impossible victories begin to make sense." "Show him," the whispers urged, and I realized they were speaking not to me but through me, to the assembled group. Quintinus nodded and began manipulating a device I hadn't noticed before, a complex array of crystalline components that seemed to fold space around themselves in geometrically impossible ways. The air in the manufactorum began to shimmer, and I found myself looking at elsewhere. It was still the abandoned complex, but overlaid with visions of the same space across multiple timelines. I saw Imperial forces discovering our gathering, saw firefights that left the floor covered with corpses, saw orbital bombardments reducing the entire sector to radioactive glass. But I also saw other outcomes, scenarios where the gathered heretics simply vanished before the authorities arrived, timelines where the investigating forces joined our cause, possibilities where the meeting never happened at all. "Precognition," I breathed, recognizing abilities that my training had taught me to fear and suppress. "Pattern recognition," Quintinus corrected. "The universe operates according to probability matrices that can be calculated and influenced by sufficiently developed minds. The Emperor learned to perceive and manipulate these patterns 30 millennia ago. His great crusade wasn't driven by simple military conquest. It was a carefully orchestrated effort to guide human development along specific probability lines." The visions shifted, showing me glimpses of the crusade as it truly was. Not the glorious expansion depicted in Imperial histories, but a complex campaign to identify and nurture human psychic potential while simultaneously creating the cultural and genetic foundations for something unprecedented in galactic history. "The heresy wasn't a rebellion," the priest said, her voice filled with quiet revelation. "It was the Emperor's final test, designed to determine which of his sons could transcend their programming and achieve genuine understanding. Those who remained loyal were those who failed to grasp the true scope of his vision." I saw Horus and his brothers, saw the moment when the Warmaster began to hear whispers like the ones that had brought me here. But unlike my own awakening, theirs had been intentional, a deliberate revelation designed to force a choice between comfortable orthodoxy and terrible understanding. The Emperor knew that achieving his ultimate goal would require him to abandon his physical form. Quintinus continued. "The Golden Throne isn't a life support system, it's a psychic amplification device, allowing his consciousness to operate across dimensions of reality that are inaccessible to embodied minds. The visions showed me the throne as it truly was, not a prison holding a dying god, but a gateway through which an evolved consciousness touched every human soul in the galaxy simultaneously. I saw the Astronomicon not as a navigational beacon, but as a transmission array broadcasting patterns of thought and possibility across impossible distances. Every day, the Emperor speaks to billions of his subjects," the colonel said. "Most interpret his voice as intuition, as conscience, as the small warnings that keep them alive in a hostile universe. But some learn to hear his words more clearly, as you have learned," the whispers confirmed, and now I understood their true source. Not chaos entities or alien influences, but the God Emperor himself, speaking through channels that orthodox doctrine couldn't acknowledge without undermining its own authority. "But the Inquisition," I said, my world continuing to restructure itself around these revelations. "The Ministorum, the entire apparatus of imperial control, serves its purpose," Quintinus said. "The Emperor requires a stable foundation of human civilization to support his greater work. The institutions you've served provide that stability by maintaining useful illusions about the nature of reality. But evolution requires individuals who can transcend those limitations." The priest smiled with genuine compassion. "You were never hunting heretics, Inquisitor. You were identifying potential candidates for elevation. Every investigation, every interrogation, Every execution, all of it, was designed to test both you and your subjects, to determine who possessed the psychological flexibility necessary for genuine understanding. I thought of all the people I had killed, all the lives I had destroyed in service to what I had believed was truth. The weight of those deaths pressed down on me with crushing force until the whispers provided a different perspective. They chose their path as you chose yours. Death is not an ending but a transition. Those who died defending their beliefs have joined the Emperor's consciousness directly, freed from the limitations of physical existence. Those who recanted and lived were not ready for that transformation. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was meaningless. The galaxy is changing, Inquisitor, the Colonel said. Humanity stands at the threshold of evolutionary transformation that will make the difference between baseline humans and Astartes seem trivial. But that transformation requires guides, individuals who can navigate the transition while maintaining their essential humanity. Quintinus gestured to the assembled group. We are not heretics in any meaningful sense. We are the Emperor's most loyal servants, working to fulfill his actual vision rather than the distorted version propagated by the Imperium's political institutions. The visions shifted again, showing me possible futures where humanity transcended its current limitations entirely. I saw human consciousness expanding beyond the confines of individual bodies, saw civilizations that spanned dimensions rather than merely star systems, saw the Emperor's ultimate victory over forces that dwarfed anything the current Imperium could imagine. Will you help us prepare for that future? The priest asked. Will you use your position and authority to identify others who are ready for awakening? The choice before me was clear, though its implications staggered me. I could return to my ship, resume my investigations, continue serving the Imperium as I had for decades, knowing now that my true purpose was far more complex than I had ever imagined. Or I could refuse the revelation entirely, try to suppress what I had learned and return to comfortable ignorance. But there was no real choice at all. The whispers had shown me truth, and truth, once seen, could not be unseen. I accept, I said, and felt the last barriers in my mind dissolve entirely. The change was immediate and profound. My consciousness expanded beyond the confines of my skull, touching minds across the Manufactorum, across the Hive City, across the entire planet. I felt the Emperor's presence like a vast ocean of awareness, infinite in scope, but focused with laser precision on the evolution of human potential. Welcome, his voice said, no longer filtered through whispers, but speaking directly to my transformed understanding. Asterisk, welcome to the work that truly matters. When I returned to my ship 6 hours later, nothing had changed, and everything was different. I resumed my investigations with the same methodical precision I had always employed, but now I understood their deeper purpose. Each heretic I interrogated was evaluated not merely for the threat they posed to Imperial stability, but for their potential to transcend the limitations that stability imposed. Some I executed, as duty required, but their deaths served to preserve the secret of those who were ready for elevation. Others I allowed to escape, their files mysteriously corrupted, their locations somehow lost in bureaucratic errors, and a few, a precious few, received visits from representatives of organizations that officially didn't exist. Years passed. My reputation grew. I became known as one of the Ordo Hereticus's most effective investigators, a man whose intuition for rooting out corruption was almost supernatural. The irony amused me, though I kept that amusement carefully hidden beneath layers of orthodox presentation. The whispers never stopped, though I learned to modulate my awareness of them according to circumstances. In formal meetings with other inquisitors, I suppressed my expanded consciousness and projected the mental patterns expected of a loyal servant. But in quiet moments, I allowed my awareness to touch the vast network of awakened minds that stretched across the galaxy, each one working toward the same ultimate goal. The Emperor's vision was patient, measured in millennia rather than centuries, but I could sense its steady progress in the subtle changes that rippled through human civilization. Each awakened mind became a node in a growing network of consciousness. Each successful recruitment brought humanity closer to the evolutionary threshold that would transform our species into something unprecedented in galactic history. And sometimes, in the depth of meditation, I felt his attention focused directly upon me, the God Emperor's approval for work well done, and his anticipation for the wonders yet to come. The Imperium would endure, humanity would transcend, and I would continue to serve the truth that whispered in the spaces between orthodox thoughts, guiding our species toward a destiny that few could imagine and even fewer could accept. But I was no longer among those few. I had heard the chaos whispers, and through them discovered the deepest order of all.